Good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Moline, the chair of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch, and one of the co-conveners of the Environmental Humanities Initiative, along with Christine Maran and Dan Philippon. And our other two panelists today, Carrie Derrickson and Hiromi Mizuno, are also affiliate faculty in this initiative. Christine is the chair of Asian Languages and Literatures, Dan is in English, Kate is in Geography, Environment, and Society, and Hiromi is in History, so you can see that we represent a wide range of disciplines. The title of our panel is Space, Land, and Environmental Humanities. Words like space and land always make me pause, perhaps because I'm a poetry scholar, or because my work in German studies is about language and culture. But today those words remind me that we are in a place that was originally inhabited by indigenous peoples. I'm reminded of a poem in Anishinaabe Baminuwon and English by Margaret Noonan, a poet who holds an MFA and PhD from the College of Liberal Arts. Her words call us to recognize our responsibilities to the material world, and it's called Fundamentals of Leadership. Like ice carving on continents, like blood salt passing through cells, understand what is seen and what is unseen, and what cannot be undone. Sometimes in the depths of change, the shadows are fish. Poems invite reflection, make us aware of things in the environment that we normally see as permanent when they are in fact dynamic. They ask us to come to terms with what we do not know and to be open to exploring. The depths of change as I see it involve what we do in the liberal arts and perspectives long present on the campus space. The mission of the university as a land-grant institution called for a bold commitment to education for the common good. In 1869, the first general report to the University of Minnesota Regents spoke about the need to balance what was called conflicting views about the proportions of the branches of learning, something that we see in the College of Liberal Arts and in the university even today. Indeed, the report stressed the larger value of a general course of study, of advocating in its words the comparative value of physical and linguistic studies and of the modern and ancient languages. Today, these branches of learning weave across the fabric of CLA departments and across interdisciplinary collaboratives like what we represent. Our diverse, transnational, multi-directional departments are fundamental to a 21st century world grant university. Our study of space, land, and environment is defined in stunning ways by an array of scholarly projects rather than by a single vision. So how does a scholar of German studies work on the environmental humanities? For me, it's meant editing a collection on foreign language teaching and the environment for the Modern Language Association, a project that foregrounds intentional practices of pedagogies for language and culture in the interest of raising environmental awareness. It's also involved just exploring the conceptual connections in German thought between post-war landscapes and abandoned post-industrial sites, or reading poetry from the Cold War era about the proliferation of nuclear weapons as a precursor to environmental activism today, and analyzing how the interdependence of humans and nature becomes visible in lines of poetry that ask such things as, who would want to live without the solace of trees? Or, what do you need to gauge how great, how small our human life? We in the liberal arts make it a practice of asking complicated questions. What brings us together in the environmental humanities is an interest in seeing where those questions will lead, how words translate into leadership. As a concept, the environmental humanities create space for discussion about human interactions with the places we inhabit, social justice questions, and the complex interface between local and global communities in the 21st century. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn now to my colleagues on this panel, starting with Christine Marin, followed by Kate Derrickson, then Hiromi Mizuno, and Dan Philippon. So, Christine.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you to Ana Paula for originally funding this initiative. We really appreciate it. And if anyone else wants to fund us, like Bud, there in the back of the room, we're welcome that. The growth of the environmental humanities today I'm basically going to just talk about a little bit of the sort of idea that kickstarted. Now I'm promoting something else, my book, Ecology Without Culture, which came out last year, 2017, December. Sort of the idea that kickstarted the book and related to this concept of the environmental humanities. The growth, I think the CLA 150, you were supposed to be looking backward in time, but it turns out when it comes to the environmental humanities, you don't have to go very far back in time. As a concept, it's actually relatively new, and I think that maybe it ends up in discourse 1998, followed up by, in Australia, 2001, and so on. So has a pretty short lifespan as a concept. But I think that the environmental humanities as a kind of institutional form is really growing, and we're starting to see environmental humanities initiatives and institutes pop up all over the place in North American institutions and also Australia, as far as I know. In terms of institutional support, traditionally I think environmental institutes have been mostly driven in the past by scientific discourse and sort of positivistic and potentially, I guess you could describe them as instrumentalist approaches to the environment to solve environmental challenges, sometimes especially through technological fixes. Yet, as we know, technological fixes are only as good as the ability to implement them in a complicated web of interests and power and self-narratives. So to implement any sort of fix at all, these questions of constituency and power must be clarified. And in this sense, humanistic thinking is probably needed. Historians, those in gender studies, those in animal studies. Hiromi as well, we come from this field called area studies. And being a specialist of an entity that was both object of geopolitical inequities vis-a-vis Western powers, Japan, but was also itself a violent colonial power, Japan, I have thought quite a lot, as we all have in area studies, about the problem of what or who constitutes a community or a constituency, geopolitically speaking. That is to say, area studies have been driven by a sort of geopolitical questions of constituency, belonging, questions of collaboration can emerge in these contexts. Our EHI, the Environmental Humanities Initiative, has, as part of its unique perspective, I think, in comparison with other environmental humanities initiatives, an emphasis on the transnational. This is important to me because it allows for us to better address these humanistic questions of power and thinking about peoples and places, but through also eco-political discourse. So one of the questions that I try to address is what is this relationship of area studies and eco-critical discourse or eco-criticism, sort of in the vein that Rob Nixon in his celebrated book Slow Violence thinks about the relationship between post-colonial critique and environmental eco-criticism. Recently, eco-critical discourse in the humanities is dominated, I think you could say, by large-scale conversations around climate crisis, especially through the concept of the Anthropocene. Especially in more theoretical work, climate crisis has been discussed through the equally large concept of the West, or in the more politically correct academic modes of address in offhand mea culpa remarks of responsibility for climate change lying with Western Enlightenment modernity. The climate discourse is in so many ways seemingly determined, in my opinion, by the cultural dichotomy of the West and the rest, a term that Stuart Hall used to describe a kind of compulsive confession of how destructive Western thought has been in some form or another. It's become a constant in eco-critical discourse in the humanities to describe the climate crisis in terms of Western technology, Western ideology. And so a question emerges, is Western being used, I'm hoping Hiromi can respond to this actually, is Western being used to refer to geographical region and ideology exported around the world, industrial modernity, or is it simply assumed that the West is site of capitalist expansionism? Or is the assumption that the West is where modernity and theory reside and where the dualistic episteme of nature, culture was invented, and therefore the most obvious place to start in making eco-political critique? Equally problematic is that the vague use of the West sets up a fantastical rest that is undifferentiated and gets constituted only via the discursive construction of the West. So coming from a, quote, non-Western, quote, field of study, I've endeavored to refuse the compulsively produced binary of West and the rest, and I'm not alone. Some academics in my field are clear, very clear, in addressing ecopolitics beyond this general dichotomy, including Ian Miller at Harvard, who argues that ecological modernity's binary of nature-culture was not a Western invention, or religion scholar Fabio Rambelli, University of California, Santa Barbara, who unpacks how Buddhism has erroneously been claimed as an environmental antidote to Western philosophy and practices. There's more room to be specific. The historian Sanjay Subramaniam has long argued that modernity was not a virus that spread from the West to the rest of the world, and that it was rather a global and conjunctural phenomenon with many iterations arising almost simultaneously in different parts of the world, and this is addressed by Amitav Ghosh in his celebrated Derangement, and more to the title. So in my book, Ecology Without Culture, I've tried to move in two directions at once to address this situation in thinking about, let's say, the problem of, ecopolitically speaking, the vulnerable and the revolutionary. To consider more sophisticated ways for thinking about collectivities. Again, trying to address the topic that we have for today of space and place and peoples. And in this regard, philosopher Sylvia Wynter has been very helpful to me. She argues for a different sort of humanistic endeavor that allows for a more expansive sense of who dissidents are beyond predictable lines, including colonialist ones. She suggests moving beyond categories that just reiterate particular scripts along the lines of celebrant's universality. She starts with the year 1492 and often returns to the year 1492, or some romanticized but essentialized community image. Her briefly mentioned concept of motley crews has been an essential one for me because through that concept, she charts her way out of binaries born through this social imaginary of celebrants and dissidents. She posits the need for a new worldview that, quote, most closely reflects our actually already existing interrelationality, a form of connectivity, quote, to each other that has long manifested itself ecologically as well as socio-systematically, end quote. And additionally, a scholar, Nandita Sharma, who writes about White, points out that we exist at least in a double capacity as now, quote, being both subject to global expansion of ruling relations, that is to say there's a recognition of power for some and not others, but simultaneously all of us under the certain types of global threats, including but not limited to nuclear devastation. So for me, an eco-critical approach to the humanities will somehow engage constituencies that don't get articulated so easily within familiar groups. And these communities, and this is the second part of the argument in my book, these constituencies will be explicitly, consciously inclusive of the material world. My goal is to suggest that even in the most radical and revolutionary politics, if the bios is reduced to conventional humanistic thinking, that is cultural humanism, that is the ethnos or the anthropos, then we severely limit our ability to account for actual vulnerable and revolutionary constituencies. So with this in mind, I've made my subject authors and filmmakers whose work challenges culturalist and essentialist visions of people and nature in the broadest sense, whose work goes beyond national kinship or questions of cultural value to identify broader collectivities, which include different organisms and beings in the material world. I've looked a lot at 1960s and 1970s artists and filmmakers in the material world. One of them was Tsuchimoto, and I'll be done really soon, but Tsuchimoto Noriaki did documentaries. He traveled to the Grassy Narrows up north and visited with the Grassy Narrows and white dog populations and talked with them about mercury poisoning in their water and so on. In addition to making many, many films about mercury poisoning in Japan, his work, for me, has proven the need for eco-political critique that more clearly accounts for the agencies of peoples and the material world itself. So even if we in the humanities have not developed a clear, easy concepts for collectivities that are inclusive of peoples, land, water, air, despite humanity's dependence on these entities, there are actually plenty of authors, poets, and filmmakers who have artfully articulated the kinds of affinities that have emerged, especially under industrial modernity. And I think eco-political criticism, humanistic endeavor can start to begin to theoretically account better, I think, for those affinities. Contemporary science has been helpful. It is through science that we increasingly understand the composition of the human body is so deeply embedded in ecological feedback loops and gives us many compelling reasons to think more carefully about what constitutes a we. And I see Charlotte's hand. How am I? I have this much. Yet humanistic discourse still has yet to develop modes through which cultural analysis can be inclusive beyond the bounds of Enlightenment humanistic discourse. The biological world has been handmaiden to producing culture and cultural identity for centuries. Cultural humanism has drawn on the material world for constellation of metaphors to serve human interest and generate processes for human groups. But for me, the environmental humanities, the eco-critical perspective, will ask whether that very formation of the humanities hasn't in fact made it difficult to address these new ways of being in the world in which we recognize ourselves as human within biological, geophysical, and atmospheric places. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Kate Derrickson. I'm a faculty member in geography, and we were given a charge, a small charge, to think about how over the course of the last 150 years, the study of space, land, and the environment has changed. And then, and answer how has that changed. So I really actually thought about that question and then decided that's a crazy thing to try to answer in 10 minutes. So what I did was what I always do, which is go back to the research that I do and the people that I work with, specifically to think about questions around land and the environment. And then, so I want to talk about the Gullah Geechee people of the Sea Islands and the work that I do there. And then I want to finish by thinking about what I think the next 150 years of scholarship on land and the environment should be. No, but some provocations on how I think about how we could and should be doing that work in this present and somewhat dreary time. So, like I said, for the past 7 years, I've been working with the Gullah Geechee people, trying to understand how I can mobilize the resources of my discipline and the university specifically, and what I think about is the means of knowledge production more generally to resource their struggle for self-determination. And together with the Gullah Geechee Sustainability Think Tank, we've identified two axes of struggle: struggles over land and land tenure, and struggles over natural resource management. So when, of course, this was on the forefront of my mind when I sat down to think about these questions. So the Gullah Geechee people are descended of freed and escaped enslaved Africans who were brought to the United States from the rice coast of Africa. They were targeted by slave traders and valued by South Carolina plantation owners for their knowledge of a particular form of rice cultivation. And because many white people were tolerant of the coastal lowland climate and environment, enslaved Africans on the plantations there were often left alone to do the work of the plantation, and their labor was managed differently than the gang system of slavery. They were managed under the task system of slavery. And why that's important is that it meant that people were able to earn money and accrue money. And so during the Civil War, when land was abandoned, there were people who were positioned, enslaved people who were positioned to purchase land. And so some of them did, and that had been abandoned by plantation owners. And today, some Gullah Geechees have deeds that date up as early as 1861. So that's 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation and 3 years before the end of the Civil War. And this land acquisition is immensely consequential for historical and contemporary geographies of the region. And part of my larger project is thinking about how those land tenure arrangements continue to shape contemporary formations in this part of the world that's one of the fastest growing parts of the country. So people were buying land on the very plantations where they had been enslaved after the Union Army liberated the Sea Islands and people fled, and this region became known as the rehearsal for Reconstruction. So you might have heard of the Port Royal experiment, during which formerly enslaved people cultivated Sea Island cotton. They built a town called Mitchellville on Hilton Head Island. And some of that land, as I said, is held onto, and some of it's expropriated when Johnson comes into office. But this area remained pretty isolated until the mid-20th century, when mosquito control tactics, air conditioning, and bridges made this a more compelling environment for the region's middle class and wealthy whites who were attracted to the beautiful natural environment, the coast, the natural resources of the region. And so you get kind of massive white in-migration to this region at the same time that we think about, like, massive suburbanization and the development of single-family homes and things like that. So that really changes the character of the region. It drives up land prices. It makes it more congested. The environment, it creates all kinds of environmental challenges, and it creates a regime of environmental governance that's around preserving the region for particular kinds of uses, and preserving the ecosystem for particular kinds of uses. So Gullah Geechees are predominantly, well, they're a mix of subsistence livelihood fishers, and the rules around fisheries management are designed so that sport fishermen can make a living taking tourists out into the area and catching big, exciting fish and so forth. A lot of the land is also used for places like uses like golf courses and gated communities, which has tremendous implications for Gullah Geechees' abilities to get to historic places, to access graveyards and cemeteries, to access fishing locations that they have historically gone to. So Hilton Head is a sea island. That's a place that people usually kind of have a mental image of. There was a time when Hilton Head was mostly black, not too long ago. So the term Gullah Geechee is something that people haven't heard a lot, and there's a variety of different reasons for that, but a lot of it is about, raises really interesting questions around archival absence and how we think about archives. So who was making the archive was deeply invested in not recognizing the humanity and the cultural practices and the legacies and histories of this group of people. But also because the term became code for backward, pre-modern, uneducated country folk who talked funny. So, Clarence Thomas was raised as a saltwater Geechee, and he uses that as an example. He says, the reason why I don't talk on the bench is because people used to make fun of how I talked. At the same time, though, the exoticism of Gullah Geechees became a marketing technique for the region, and we've seen something like a museumification of the culture. And it's perverse in the sense that it demands a near total eradication of the culture in order to make it quaint and marketable, but not formidable. And so Queen Quet, who was here last year as a Winton Cornerstone visitor and as a collaborator and a partner of mine, says there's something pathological about standing in front of someone and telling them that their culture is dead. It's almost always represented by outsiders as endangered, an extinct kind of relic of the past, a quaint footnote in history, in a region which sells itself as a place where history lives. That's Charleston's motto. And that's a menacing, if perversely accurate, tagline for a region where 40% of enslaved Africans first set foot in the US. So the telos of cultural eradication looms large in the tellings of Gullah Geechee lives and livelihoods, where regional boosters unironically destroy and appropriate Gullah Geechee symbols and traditions. But scholarship, even that which understands itself to be in solidarity with Gullah Geechee people, can perhaps inadvertently reproduce this erasure. So historian Andrew Carl, I didn't know this was going to be recorded, who's done great work on the history of African American land loss in the region, have been far less responsive to the fact of Gullah Geechees who make their lives and continue to make their lives in that region, saying things in interviews sort of in an offhand way about traces of lost cultures that you can see in the landscape today. Citing the absence of the archive is the reason why he doesn't use the term Gullah Geechee without a real, in my opinion, considered engagement with the idea of archival absence. But while the discipline of history has had its own problematic engagements with Reconstruction, captured well in Du Bois's chapter, The Propaganda of History, of late there have been much better and more compelling treatments of the period. But history as a discipline, I could just write it off, no, struggles to think the future with people who are alive today. It has a lot to contribute, obviously, and that goes without saying, but in my experience, and I'd be interested to hear what other people think about this, it does struggle to think the future with people who are alive today. At the same time, my own discipline's ignorance of the Reconstruction era, like sheer and total ignorance, and the way in which a series of struggles over, the way in which Reconstruction was a series of struggles over what it means to be free, allows for the reproduction of a radical break between slavery and industrialization, where my discipline picks up questions of urbanization, land, racialization, and the environment. And as Catherine McKittrick argues, who's a geographer and a women's studies scholar and a Black studies scholar, she writes that scholarship that concerns itself with the racialized violence and dispossession may have the perverse effect of fetishizing Black suffering and inadvertently foreclose emancipatory futures by always framing Blackness in relation to violence or death. And she writes, "We would do well to notice that scholarly and activist questions can at times be so tightly tied to bits and pieces of narrative that dwell on anti-Black violence and Black racial death, seeking out and reprising terrible utterances to reclaim and recuperate Black loss and somehow make it all the less terrible, that our answerable analytical futures are also condemned to death." So here is the feminist interdiction that how we study things is related intimately to the futures that we might bring about, even or especially when we imagine ourselves to be making new knowledge to bring about emancipatory and anti-racist futures. So if the question is, how do the legacies of Reconstruction matter for contemporary struggles over land tenure and natural resource management in Gullah Geechee Nation, which I would argue is the question that Gullah Geechees are interested in a way, what does that mean for their capacity to realize the environmental futures they want to see? And we have to pause, I think, as we presume to know what the liberal arts can offer these questions. We have to pause to consider whether these are actually knowledge problems, or whether they're in fact resource problems or power problems. And if they're the latter, I think we need to think really carefully about what our knowing in the world does. So yes, of course, clearly, the next 150 years of the liberal arts demands interdisciplinarity, as the question suggested. And my project, I think, bears that out. But it also requires new forms of engagement and accountability to think about the work that our knowledge projects do in the world, both the work that our stories and narratives and findings and all that do, but also the relationships that we engender in that process. So this means focus on knowing and the process of producing knowledge that prefigures liberatory futures. And I just have a few examples, and then I'll be done. So we can think of a lot of examples from liberal arts and social sciences of disconnects between the purported commitments of the scholars and the scholarship that are out of joint with the approach to being in the academy and making knowledge. So in my own discipline, one of the leading scholars of neoliberalism and the critiques of neoliberalism in the 1990s has become one of the premier architects of the neoliberalization of higher education in the British Academy. And one of my fellow geographers has asked whether we should really be that surprised by that. In other words, what assumptions do we make about the politics that follow on from the arguments that we make, especially when the ways of knowing that undergird it are so fundamentally conservative? Another example that I've written about is philosopher Rebecca Tuvel's piece in defense of transracialism, in which she compares what she calls transgenderism, which is her term, to the public embrace of Caitlyn Jenner with what she calls transracialism and the public critiques of Rachel Dolezal, a woman who was born white and claimed to be black and then later transracial. And in defending her piece, Tuvel said that she wrote it out of a frustration with how women of color and marginalized groups are often, quote unquote, silenced. And this was a really curious claim to me, given that her work failed to engage any women of color in her analysis. It failed to respond to any critiques that women of color and transgender people had raised about her analysis. And so this idea that she was addressing silencing in the process of what I would argue is the reproduction of that silencing was strange. And then lastly, we might think about how people who theorize power and how it works are themselves conduits of power in their academic positions and relationships. In the recent Avital Ronell case, and the response of senior scholars who made their careers critiquing the social hierarchies sedimented in the deployment of power appeared really comfortable with their own ability to deploy it. So I guess I deleted my conclusion, but I just want to end by saying that I think that how we think about land and how we think about struggles over the environment are, there's a lot of really important questions about what we should study, but I'm more interested in questions about how we study it and how we make those institutions in which those questions are studied.
So here comes a historian. I'm going to make 2 points today. The first point is about the bad marriage between the humanitarian discourse or humanitarianism and technocracy. And then the second point is where we, the American academia, should go from here. So I am actually being bold enough to predict the future. So I want to start with the legendary figure, Norman Borlaug. So this only goes to maybe 75 years, maybe not 150 years, but Norman Borlaug, agronomist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, is probably one of the most famous people that the EU has produced. If you're in the area of agriculture, plant pathology, world food problem, etc., etc. His mentor, Elvin Stackman, a plant pathologist, there is a St. Paul campus building named after him. Right. So, and the EU had these 2 prominent figures because of its status as a land-grant institution. Of course. These 2 men are the founding fathers of the Green Revolution. Right? For some people, the Green Revolution that the United States initiated in the 60s and 70s was a great success that fed the growing population in the world and more specifically in Asia. Since Obama, it has been again promoted to feed Africa. But for some people, it caused, and it's still causing, environmental damage and environmental injustice. I've recently offered a freshman seminar called The Politics of Hunger to discuss this issue. I wanted students to understand how not just the Green Revolution, but also the American media's feminization of famine and poverty in the so-called developing world and the US food diplomacy being part of our current problems. And we discussed the contemporary food sovereignty movement as a counter movement. Just as a record, of course, Borlaug, unlike your people, has an excellent collection here in the university archive. And it's really always fun to bring freshman students to the special collections in Anderson Library, especially the basement storage space, and they really go, oh. The main message of this seminar and my current problematic is the danger of over-reliance on science and technology when solving the food and population problems. So now here I echo Christine's point, which is really essentially a political, social, and economic problems. And I don't think I need to cite Amartya Sen in front of this audience to make this point. The Green Revolution was a Cold War attempt, understood to be a counter-revolution against the Red Revolution and the White Revolution, that's the Islamicist revolution. The Green Revolution takes place as a package deal of the improved seeds, so those are the high-yield dwarf varieties, specifically engineered and bred to work with a high dose of chemical fertilizer, and a really good irrigation. Right? They all need to be packaged together. So you cannot just get improved seeds and plant them and expect higher yield. It requires a whole new economic and finance system. It requires farmers who want to invest big for the prospect of profits. It requires a larger state and corporate power to construct dams and irrigation systems. It also requires a new level of international networks of researchers, philanthropic foundations, multinational corporations, etc. So my current research is a history of chemical nitrogenous fertilizer in Asia, centering on Japan. Too often, agricultural modernization in Asia is told as a story of this US-led Cold War Green Revolution. This is certainly part of the story, but Asia had been engaged in agricultural modernization way before that. And chemical nitrogen had been circulating in a humongous capacity and quantity in the Japanese Empire and beyond, well before the US presence there. Asia then, during the first half of the 20th century, as well as during the Cold War, actually looks really different from what the US-focused scholarship has made us think. I wish that I had a book like Christine to promote, but it's in production. Hopefully it'll be done soon. So now the Cold War is long over, but the neo-Malthusian humanitarian discourse that supported this Green Revolution about the food and population problem is perhaps even louder. And the food and population problem continues to be perceived as a security issue. We hear constantly the term food security. By 2050, the world population is projected to become 9 billion. The neo-Malthusian discourse of feed 9 billion is rampant. National Geographic has a beautiful website, Feeding 9 Billion, with really gorgeous photos and 5-step solutions that are essentially engineering technocratic solutions, right? Innovations, that's the key word. There's also a really interesting initiative called Feeding 9 Billion Challenge. It's a competition across universities in Canada, and now it's international, challenging undergraduate students to work in teams to propose and develop technologically innovative projects. These new initiatives do talk about sustainable agriculture, unlike the Green Revolution of the past. Sustainable agriculture is, of course, a great ideal, but if that goal is used to put more money in scientific and technological innovations, and here, of course, innovations, as we all know here, are supposed to be the hallmark of academic excellence and national power, then we in the humanities must intervene. We must learn from history. does history actually teach us anything? So I used to say, no. No, history doesn't repeat. No, studying great men in the past doesn't make you a great man, you know. But none of those practical goals history is supposed to be for. But these days, I actually am saying yes, right? We do need to learn from the past, and Kate is right, though. I think historians refuse to predict future. We can't, but we are here to educate the future generations. So for example, I'm thinking about a course, like History of Environmental Justice, not to teach what has happened or how the environment had been destroyed or people had been displaced, et cetera, but just teach students how to do research, how to find the case studies, court cases of local initiatives, grassroots organizations doing this and that, and then teach them how to make their own argument, solid argument, how to write it in a lucid manner, and how to publish it online, right? And I would probably focus on dams and hydropower stations to do this, because it's not just about land and people, it is also about ecological imperialism, ethnic minority policies, nation building, the creation of primitive accumulation. I mean, it just can go to different directions. Post-colonial Asia is the land of dam building. Right? Mm-hmm. So I can have many interesting examples to kind of put in this class. Nick Kulather's article, Damming Afghanistan, has examined a hugely ironic dam building in Afghanistan, modeled after and actually done by the US in the 50s, which failed to achieve its initial agricultural goal, but ended up only strengthening the state power of the power of the Afghan state and the cultivation of poppy seeds. Well, now India has a $236 million contract to build more dams in Afghanistan on the Kabul River. In fact, India has actually built what's called the India-Afghanistan Friendship Dam already there, having caused much anger in the downstream Iran. But then, of course, Iran and Pakistan been building dams all over too. Right? I would also, or maybe I should just skip a little for the sake of time. So post-colonial developmentalism involved not only the Cold War and American aid, but also developmental dictators of the so-called Third World, as well as large aid givers, such as Japan, France, Germany, etc. The rise of Asia in the past 3 decades means countries like China, Korea, and India have joined this category of aid givers, building dams and aggressively engaging with agricultural modernization all over the world. They use the same old humanitarian discourse to save the world, to feed the world population. So here's kind of the second point where, that I said I would make. So perhaps the greatest legacy of the American Green Revolution is this marriage between the world-saving cry of humanitarianism and technocracy. The legacy continues and is fully utilized by the newly powerful Asian countries that continue to build dams, displace human and non-human inhabitants, and restructure society in the countries in the manner that Justin McBrien and Jason Moore has called necrocene. This is kind of as opposed to the Anthropocene along the line of Capitalocene. Asia matters here, not because it's production of wealth, as people tend to think, but because of its destruction. Going back to my first point, so we humanists, must resist the urge to humanize technology and science in an attempt to make humanities relevant. putting the humanitarian language over to STEM and stuff like that is an easy way to make this relevancy happen. But our history has demonstrated grave problems with this. So rather than jumping on the bandwagon, we in humanities need to deconstruct this humanitarianism itself and critically intervene in the technocratic gospel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks to the organizing committee for the opportunity to join this panel and for acknowledging the importance of the environmental humanities to CLA's next 150 years. For my contribution, I thought it'd be most appropriate if I read from the conclusion to a chapter in my current manuscript on the literature of the sustainable food movement. This chapter concerns the writing of Carlo Petrini, the founder of the slow food movement, and it's based on the 5 months my family and I spent in the Piedmont region of Italy while I was on a Fulbright fellowship to research this project and teach at the University of Gastronomic Sciences. It's a long and complicated chapter, but as you will see, this is literally the take-home message. I chose this excerpt for 3 reasons. First, because I think it speaks to the historical breadth that our celebration of CLA's 150 years seeks to acknowledge, as well as the transnational focus of our environmental humanities initiative. Second, because it addresses what I see as a necessary and fundamental shift in how we perceive the places we inhabit, this thing we call the environment, as well as the relationships between the local and the global. And finally, like Kate, because I think it offers an interesting methodological example of how we might do environmental humanities work that is more deeply embedded in and responsive to the communities in which that work takes place. And because I'm in English, I also want to acknowledge in a small way the importance of the relationship between style and content. So this is the conclusion to my chapter, The Gastronome, reading Carlo Petrini in Italy. Is slow food perfect? By no means. But is the world a better place because it exists? I think so. And the writing of Carlo Petrini is part of the reason why the idea that our food should be good, clean, and fair is increasingly being referenced as a handy shorthand for how to measure the sustainability of our food system, both locally and globally. But beyond this valuable yet abstract contribution of Petrini's is something else that has stood out to me in the time I have spent thinking and writing about his work. This is his understanding that as important as discussions of regional, national, and global food policy may be, it is ultimately our relationships with individual people that matter the most. Consider the comments he makes near the end of his book, Food and Freedom. What it does not take to make ambitious projects happen, he says, is megastructures. What is important is to be conscious of one's limits and allow oneself to be regenerated by the people encountered on one's path. If I look back at our history, he continues, the history of slow food, I see an evolution of content, but also of many wonderful people. And it is my contention that they have all been fundamental, even if some of them have now moved in different directions. He concludes, I will always admire the constant efforts of those who have had the courage to continue with us, and even of those who have not, to put themselves on the line. While Petrini's discussions of food communities may sometimes seem academic, they are nonetheless grounded in an appreciation of and genuine affection for the real people who compose those communities, which raises the question of Petrini's ultimate commitments, his core values, what he finds most meaningful about the idea of community. I would put it this way. What do we have if not connections to one another? This may seem an obvious or simplistic point, but the deeper these connections go, the richer our lives become. Commodity chains tend toward the shallow, while community relationships tend toward the deep. And by deep, I mean the way that repeated experiences and shared commitments result in lives rich in meaning, lives worth living. In his book Terra Madre, Petrini says that community is where genuine food production, interpersonal relationships, and knowledge transmission still count. A statement that also reminds me of Adam Gopnik's conclusion in his book The Table Comes First, that a life lived with a face on our food is a richer life than one lived without it. Both comments get at the same idea, that sustainability must ultimately be about more than just the environment. Even if industrial food systems turn out to be more efficient in terms of carbon emissions or feeding the world, can they truly be called sustainable if they foster disconnected, mechanical, and abstracted relationships between people and their food sources? If they suggest that individuals can exist outside of ecological communities? Or if they fail to foster the development and maintenance of local and regional food cultures? Another way to think about this is to consider what would be lost if so-called environmental considerations became the only ones that mattered, much as the opposite has been true for so long with food, when all that mattered was taste. Isn't a dinner that is clean, that is made from certified organic ingredients, but otherwise generic and unremarkable, inherently less interesting than one that is embedded in some kind of culinary, historical, or community context? I think so. Both dinners may be equally sustainable in terms of their environmental footprint, but not so in terms of their cultural sustainability, in terms of our relationships with and connections to one another in the places that we live, work, and play each day. The day before we were set to leave the hilltop town we called home in Italy, our next-door neighbor, Franco, whose wife used to run the grocery store in town, flagged us down as we were coming down the walk. He had a large paper shopping bag with him, and he held it up to us as we approached. Throughout the 5 months we lived there, Franco had been renovating the villa next door for his daughter. It was a beautiful stone house, 400 years old, and we watched as he worked on it every day except Sunday, serving as his own general contractor. Bright orange fencing blocked off part of his yard, and piles of bricks and construction debris were perpetually scattered about. Trucks would come and go, and our rural idyll would be regularly interrupted by the sound of drills, concrete mixers, hammers, and bursts of shouted instructions in Italian. Like Petrini's experience in his own Piedmontese town, this was still the beautiful country, but it was also a working landscape, full of people whose daily tasks often required intruding on the oral and visual landscape of their neighbors. And so Franco had come to say he was sorry. In the bag were 3 bottles of his homemade wine, a Dolcetto, a Barbera, and an unlabeled white, a large jar of Piedmontese honey, another big jar of local chocolate sauce, and a box of cremiri, or little cornmeal cookies from our favorite bakery in the town next over. Little did Franco know that our bags were already packed and carefully weighed so as to come in just under the 50-pound limit for an international flight. And everything he gave us, with the exception of the cremiri, was a liquid that could not be placed in our carry-on luggage. We would have to repack everything and mail another box home in less than 24 hours. And yet, this was undoubtedly the most memorable gift any of us had ever been given. This was not just any food. It was a symbol of this place and of Franco's pride in living there. We had shared this time with him and he with us, and it was important that we remembered him and his home with fondness. Our relationship mattered, and he expressed its significance in the best way he knew how, through a gift of handcrafted food. He was sorry, he said, for having disturbed us. But the process of renovating his villa took time. It was slow going, and work like this could not be rushed. Like Italians throughout history, he was not building something for the moment. He was building something for the ages. Thanks very much.
Thank you. What we had in mind to do with this panel was to open things up for discussion after each of us spoke. There are so many phrases that resonate with me from each of the speakers. From Christine, I'm thinking about all the discussions of how power and control of the environment is so intricately intertwined with who are we as humans, what do we think we're actually doing in this environment that we live in. With Kate, I was struck by your imperative to us to think about the future, think into the future in the work that we're doing. Hiromi, your phrase about the persistence of discourses, and I was thinking the entire time about the fact that Borlaug's Cape is just around the corner in this building, and we could go see it and not quite touch it, but it is here. And Dan, as you were talking about community relationships and what makes life living, all of that circled back to, I think, to the earlier presentations that we were having. So with those things in mind, I wanted to open this up to discussion with the audience. We might want to think about what is sustainability, that as we think about it today, what do we think of space and land and environment going forward in the college and the university over the next however many years? What will that look like to us? So, questions, responses?
You have someone who can,
Yeah.
you have a mic for that, so you can get that up and recording.
Yeah. So, Anna Paula, since you were the person who, in a way, got us started on this whole project, and perhaps you would say something.
There was a point during my tenure as Associate Dean for Arts and Humanities when Dean Coleman allowed for the use of X amount of dollars to enhance the arts and humanities in CLA. And I had I was free to use that money as I wished. And I thought that the best way was to zero in areas of the expertise in which several colleagues I knew were involved and yet did not have visibility, representation in the college. And so very deliberately, I was not democratic at all. Very deliberately, I thought of those colleagues, and I called on one or two of them and said, look, I have this money. Are you interested in putting together a group that has both research, teaching, and ideally community engagement dimensions? That's how it began, and how we put together environmental humanities and 3 other research initiatives. But the money was given to us by Dean Coleman's commitment to do something in the area of arts and humanities.
Another question?
So maybe we should talk among ourselves, because we had a lot of ideas that we've been working on that we don't necessarily have time to discuss with each other, but we could bring that up now. So, would like to.
I have a couple questions. The first question would be for Hiromi, where I think my question would be, this question of exportation of knowledge. So on the one hand, there's a sense with regard to agriculture that there's an already there in Asia in terms of agricultural production. But then you had also talked about the exportation of notions involved with the Green Revolution. So there's a sort of, how can I put it? There is a kind of notion there of Western modernity vis-a-vis agriculture as a kind of, anyway, virus, right? So where it sort of, there's something born here, right, in the U.S., and then it goes out and sort of infects, I guess you could say, Asia. Would you say that is the sort of trajectory that you're talking about, or how does that get complicated? Because I'm sure there are potentially international academic relationships, international institutional relationships that were formative even in the Green Revolution, right? Mm-hmm. That give it this really potentially international dimension, about which I don't know anything, so.
Yeah, well, thank you. I don't see it that way at all. In fact, it is the US-focused Cold War studies that make that picture, that there's something born in the US or the West. Doesn't matter if it's a Cold War or not. And then it emanates, right? That's the old civilization discourse. Certain things, I think, went like that. Certain industrialization-related technologies, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to agriculture, the point is really the opposite, that Asia wasn't this backward agricultural peasant land with tons of people just being born every day, and that something had to be intervened, and therefore modernized way of life, way of mentality, the agriculture, et cetera, it really is not like that, because the agriculture wasn't there in the way that American diplomats and strategists envisioned it. The model that I really am trying to promote is actually, people use the word South to South or Asia to Asia. It is not from one US place, emanating or spreading the virus or exporting out technology and ideas. Mm-hmm. Right? But rather, the world actually had happened and were happening already. Mm-hmm. And the connections actually between those countries or societies and the people is so much deeper than what one superpower can just do. So I really think that that's simply a wrong model to think about. So I'm not sure if the word export is even the right word. I like the word circulation and a connection rather than exporting something out. Don't know if I responded to you. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask what you think that means then for this particular institution going forward. So if we are sitting on this incredible set of resources and we have this institution that is like a factory of knowledge production, and we recognize like the hegemony of this region, this place, these institutions in kind of problematic power structures. If the answer isn't, I believe the answer is not burn it down. The answer is like mobilize it differently. So what is the different mobilization of all the expertise that exists in this place that does not reproduce that kind of problematic, unidirectional relationship, but instead taps into these circuits of existing relationships? Like, what does that look like for you?
I think it had always been that. So we think that we're exporting things out. But that is not how the world sees it or how the world functions. It's just we have to change the way we understand ourselves. We're actually only a tiny point of the huge, huge circulation. But because we're in the US, and because history often does get dominated by scholars of America, that we just think that there is the center, which is wrong, right?
We don't have to do anything differently.
That it means that it really does acknowledge what had the dynamics that had already been there. Right? So some of us actually locate the beginning of Green Revolution in the early 20th century in Japanese Empire, because the Japanese agronomists did the exact same thing as Borlaug tried to do 40 years later, right? To call it really the Green Revolution, that's not really the point. The point is it's not the US gospel of Cold War just trying to change things. But I do think that having that world power, the actual power in geopolitics, of course, does change things. So that's why this world-saving humanitarianism, that discourse is so powerful. And I really do think that the young generation, and we were once like that, right? I mean, we're ambitious, really want to change the world, not as cynical or, and the university students here, many students so sincerely really want to contribute, and that's including engineering students too. And tapping into that passion in the wrong directions that's where I really have a problem. So the CLA's language and policy, that kind of seems like, oh, no, we're going to join that bandwagon, we're going to save the world. We can't just leave it to engineering students because they don't know culture, they don't know politics. We'll teach them those things so that they can be a better engineer. That is just not the way to go. That's what I think. So I know I'm not directly answering your question, but I really don't think that the world has operated in a way that there's the center of power and then emanating everything, colonizing everything, or semi-colonizing everything. That is just us being, in an attempt to be critical of ourselves, again, kind of reinforcing, like you're saying, reinforcing the very structure that you ought to be critiquing.
Yeah. So Dan, and then we have a question from the audience.
Yeah, this is brief, but there's both a theoretical and a practical component or answer in part to your question, and that is I was in a meeting yesterday for the new Pillsbury Hall that's being renovated for the Department of English and CLA. And we were talking, at least briefly, about the Humanities Engagement Lab that will be part of that building. And I asked the question, what exactly is this thing? And what it turns out it is precisely one attempt the college has to answer your question, which is to say, what would it look like if the college were to engage communities by listening more rather than talking more? And so this will be a space in Pillsbury Hall which will allow communities with whom we are in conversation to shape that conversation with a public face and engage with us as much as the other way around. And so this will be a messy process of forming what this thing is, as these kinds of conversations can and must be. But I think it's one really hopeful direction for CLA in the next 50 years, if not 150, for having conversations that are not simply one-way conversations.
Yeah. So we have a question.
I wrote, in political science, there's a lot of concern about the rise of China and the new geopolitics. And so my question is, honestly, I'm not a specialist on sustainable development, but you really made me think about the Green Revolution. But does the rise of China, the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Asian Infrastructure Bank, does this mean that in our lifetimes we will see an authentic Asian approach to agricultural and other kinds of development that are counterfactually different than what we would have realized had the Green Revolution never occurred? Or will this simply reproduce the Western path all over again?
I suppose you're asking me. So again, I don't call agricultural modernization the Western, because then you would be in this anachronistic position to say, well, what Japanese were doing in Taiwan in 1910s was predating what the West was going to do, right? So whether or not you call the modernization itself a Western project is a whole another issue. But so that's just a, is there even a Asian way of doing this? No.
I think that's the issue. There's a
Yeah.
certain point where technology is shared. I mean, I think it's becoming increasingly impossible to imagine through sort of cultural discourse difference within these certain kinds of shared technologies, isn't there?
Well,
The Chinese are at the center of this.
yeah.
Have some significance, does it not?
Oh, it is so significant. And yes, China is taking over the agricultural aid with a bigger infrastructural projects in the world, Africa and Middle East. But that's because, and so, you know, sure, China has seen it, how the US has done, right? Or how the Soviet has done. And then it finds its way to do, because it's not just a good, the good image diplomacy, right? In order for you, I mean, if you give aid and if you do certain projects, dam construction, agricultural modernization, anything you do, you are actually basically giving those receivers the status of the future customers, right? If you're using a Chinese screws and they only fit in a Chinese rails, you're going to be ordering those screws when the new infrastructural improvement happens. When something needs to be repaired, then you will be calling Chinese engineers to do that, right? That's how the system of the aid works, right? It's just a free food at the beginning, but then that guarantees the future customers. That's not a Chinese invention. That's not a US invention. That has just always been like that, and they know.
It might have been a Han invention, actually, because in the Han Dynasty, you have the repetition, I forgot the term for it, but when you have standardization.
Standardization. Well, so, but then
If you want to go back that far, I mean, you could always go back
but
really
it's
far
not
and find-
standardized enough to be completely replaceable. There is the French engineers, certain things that the French uses, so when your machine is broken, you actually do have to call this French company to fix it, right? People don't always share everything. The companies don't share everything. But I don't know if you know how those new varieties of seeds get made. And these days, of course, it's a lab works. But it's not easy. I mean, you're talking about the actual pollens cross-generating this and that. It takes 10 years for a crop to actually stabilize, and you can actually use it as a real crop, those seeds, right? So it's not a quick and fix or anybody can, but then at the same time, there isn't really a, what's the word, American way of doing the cross-pollination. You know what I mean? It is, everyone has to do it in the way that the nature accepts.
Yeah.
So-
And I think that's something that was coming out in the other presentations too, when Dan is talking about the heritage of the food that's being produced, and Kate is talking about conditions persisting over long periods of time, and then determining what's going to happen in the future. We had another question, and I'd like to acknowledge that. So-
Thank you.
Thank you to the panel. I'm a current graduate student in political science. I study international relations, and I really appreciated the discussion of the transnational aspect of our challenge of climate crisis, climate change. But I also wanted to push on that because I also really appreciated how centered the concept of the political was in each speaker's presentation, and how contemporary international relations scholarship shows persuasively that traditional approaches to studying climate change from top down have not proven to be effective. For example, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and NGOs, non-government actors that serve to buttress the structures that they in fact set out to interrogate. So to that end, I was hoping that perhaps any or all of you would speak to how the liberal arts might be used moving forward by communities. And specifically, if you can think of examples, or if you can think along these lines of local governments and not just non-government actors, working in a very political way to translate those very contextualized particular solutions to the global level, because climate action does necessitate, for better or for worse, some level of collaboration.
Yeah.
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 So, you know, one thing that I'm affiliated with the Institute on the Environment, and one of the things that really struck me in the last few years is a shared understanding of the simultaneity of the urgency of the questions that we have before us and the limited reach of our scholarly knowledge in addressing those, and a real enthusiasm across the ecological sciences to work with folks who have connections with communities, to take new approaches to making knowledge about what we might do in the face of this. And I think that's changing changing optimism about what our centralized government might be able to do, changing optimism about what our world system might be able to do, and a rethinking of the kind of ways that our own expectations about how that change might happen. Like, I went to this great talk recently about how the obsession of conservation scientists with the idea of scaling up and what solutions might scale inadvertently overlooks the proliferation of all different kinds of individual approaches that are organically growing up in different places that together might amount to something, but if we are constantly dismissing them as localized projects because we're obsessed with something that could scale, not only are we overlooking them, but we're kind of doing violence to the political and culturally specific and localized enthusiasms that exist. So just a little plug for a project that I'm working on. We have established through the Grand Challenges Initiative a project called the CREATE Initiative, where we are an interdisciplinary team working collaboratively with communities in Minneapolis and Atlanta as in our first round, although we're looking at the Mississippi River Corridor as our next phase, to develop a policy think tank, as well as a research team, as well as a graduate training component, to take our interdisciplinary commitments and our shared ethos around this university being for communities and sparking concern around the intersections of, not sparking concern, tapping into existing initiatives around the intersections of water and equity, to mobilize our kind of interdisciplinary expertise to ask and answer in conversation with communities questions they want to know the answer to. And that has meant we've got ecologists getting up to speed on housing policy, because when they go out into the world and want to tell somebody about stormwater management, people want to talk to them about housing policy. And there's an intimate connection between, for everyday people, between infrastructure investment and gentrification. And so now we're like, okay, it's not going to work for you to go out and say, look at this beautiful city that you could have that's ecologically sensitive and sustainable, when people look at that picture and say, I don't see myself in that, because this is going to be a neighborhood I can't afford to live in, so I'm not interested in this conversation. So now we're, through our conversations, all collectively coming to understand how culturally geographically, temporally specific our responses to these questions might have to be, and how if we want our expertise to travel and be effective and do good work in the world, that the answer isn't to lord it over people. The answer is to tap into existing energies and figure out how we can make our expertise travel in those ways.
Dan, I'm thinking that you might want to say something about slow food movement and how it would relate to this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's they're wrestling with this very question about the interrelationship between the local and the global. And so on the one hand, here's a group of people who are really trying to maintain and build and develop a set of local solutions and acknowledge local food producers and artisan food producers at the same time as they recognize the value of global markets for them. And there's no, they have yet to be able to reconcile those two things, that you can both want to have the solution be local and empower local communities, but in order to do that, you need to put your food into Italy and have it appear in Chicago and New York and Tokyo and elsewhere. I think it's a problem writ large that we're not necessarily going to be able to provide an answer for, but I do think that, as you pointed out, some of the most interesting and effective and innovative solutions are happening on the local level. We can look at the attempts at international climate change policy and see that, but we can also see efforts like the Transition Town movement, for instance, here in the U.S. and elsewhere, that is trying to make the kinds of changes that are responsive to the very local, localized communities that Kate mentioned. And so I don't know of an answer other than to, I mean, I would put my money on the local communities, just like I think that the most valuable thing that Slow Food can contribute is a focus on those very specific producers who are working on the food in their regions and are responsive to those traditions and those communities.
Christine, yeah.
So with regard especially to climate change, you're saying local. So when I was living in Tokyo a couple of years ago and went to the city building in Musashi, the city buildings, a lot of them now have ivy growing up the side. I mean, this is just a specific example, but a lot of very, very different from, I've lived in Japan many different times over the decades, but so a lot of ivy being to protect the windows from the sun so that less air conditioning have to be used. A lot of technologies of running cold water or water up and down windows, multiple stories to do cooling instead of using air conditioners. Then walking into the city building and then seeing actually the data on how much energy is being saved. In this way, I think Japanese local governments are being really proactive about guarding against climate change in some ways, I guess you could say a modest way, but actually a really compelling way. And then also sharing that data with users is also compelling because you're basically getting individual citizens and so on to think about, well, okay, it's dark in this hallway and I need to find room 203, but hey, that's okay because dimming the lights is making a difference. I can see the data on the wall. The thing that's kind of interesting to me is that regards nuclear power, because of course Japan recently in 2011 underwent 4 nuclear reactor meltdowns, and we still seem to have this conversation about whether nuclear power is one way to, right, in some help the climate crisis. And if we were able to really listen to people from Fukushima, really, really, really listen to them, the conversation about whether we even want to at all pursue this notion of the nuclear would be quite different. And in fact, there was the cohort that came from Fukushima a couple years ago and spoke here in McNamara. But the thing is they were all representing the prefecture of Fukushima and its economic viability, which meant that the course line, we're fine. everything's fine. You know, so the messaging that was coming out of Fukushima at the level of prefecture was everything is fine, we can keep going with nuclear power. But then again, if you go down to a very, very local level, even individual level, then of course ideas around that are going to be very, very different. So I think you're absolutely right to question sort of what level of government, what level of engagement are we looking at when we're thinking about how people conceive of the climate crisis. And then I would just add, you know, what technology are we exactly talking about here, including the nuclear.
Can I add just one other quick thing?
Sure.
I'm sorry. And that is just to also consider the premise of your question, which is a good one, which is that we have an obligation to help solve problems. But that's not our only role, I think, in CLA. And the climate crisis is a great example of that, in that it's not merely a crisis of carbon, it's also a crisis of meaning. So while it is important for us to find avenues through which we can help create solutions, we also have to acknowledge the self-reflective aspect of this moment and what that means for our understanding of ourselves as human beings at this time. And so I'm team teaching a class with Jessica Hellman, the director of the Institute on the Environment, this semester in the Grand Challenge curriculum to address that very question. It's called Living the Good Life at the End of the World, Sustainability in the Anthropocene, and trying to say, what does the good life mean not only for us as a society, but for each of us as individuals at a time of immense environmental challenges.
Did we have 1 more minute, 2 more minutes? Do you know? Okay. And other?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess these locals, what we really need to do, and I hope that CLA really can have an impact on this, is connecting those locals, right? That connection is what really will make the movement sustainable and consciousness sustainable, because it is so hard to keep going at the local level for a long time. So communication, writing, publication, I mean, that's what we are proud of doing.
Translation.
Yeah, translations, really. Not the technological fix again, but really connecting. So otherwise, you know, the culture, I mean, I think that most people want to protect immediate culture, but that shouldn't be taken over by, right, the nationalized culture. Like, here's a Chinese way of doing this, or here's a Japanese way of doing that. As in the way of ecology without cultures, right? You have to really think about the actual local, not just as a pocket, but a continuum that still needs to be connected. Yeah.
And I think that all of us see that in the work that we do. I certainly see that in the context of what's happening in Germany, which began with the local and is very transnational in the ways that all the other projects that have been described today are. So I'd like to thank the audience for being here and for your questions, and look forward to seeing you in the future.
At our meetings for
At our
EHI.
meetings. So.